everybody. I know that you don't know me, and I don't know if this will mean a whole lot to you, but I just want you to know how proud I am of each and every one of you that's in here right now. And so before we go any further, I just want you all to give yourselves a round of applause, just real quick. Do it, recognize. And you may be wondering, why am I proud of you? Why should you be proud of yourselves? Because I know that we're in the Denver area and the Broncos are playing in a playoff game right now, and you are here. And I know there's other people that have given into the idolatry that is professional sports that are at home or at the game. And so I just want you to know how it's like at our church, like the early service after time change, the people that show up, I'm incredibly proud of them because of how, so I just want you to know your sacrifice is appreciated and I'm very grateful that you are here. So feel good about yourselves this afternoon. And we are continuing in this series called God Underscored. And we're looking at kind of different characteristics or attributes of God. And what we're looking at today is this idea that God is a comforter. The first part of the Bible, what we call the Old Testament, sometimes it's referred to as the Hebrew Bible, is essentially the story and the faith and the tradition of ancient Israel. And within the Old Testament, there's a book called Psalms, and Psalms is this collection of ancient Israel's poetry and worship, and it's filled with all different kinds of songs. And one of the themes you'll see over and over again throughout the Psalms is this idea that Israel believed that their God was a God who comforted them. Here's just one example, Psalm 86:17. You, Lord, have helped me, and you have comforted me. Comfort literally means to ease someone's grief. The idea of being a comforter is in the midst of loss or grief, you bring hope and you bring peace. And so this is what Israel believed about their God, that our God is a God who comforts us. Now that may not seem like that big of a thing to believe or to claim. In fact, most of us, we'd probably want to say, well, yeah, if there is a God, that God should be a comforting God. But what I want us to see is that in the context of the ancient world, the fact that Israel proclaimed and believed their God was a comforting God was really like a radical deviation from what most people and most civilizations believed about gods and goddesses. Now, most of us are probably not experts on ancient civilizations, but we've probably seen some depiction of really the most common ones are like Greek mythology. Like if you get into if you've ever seen like Hercules, a Disney movie or anything like that. Egyptian mythology can tend to be kind of common. If you saw like the old mummy movies or anything like that, or sometimes Roman mythology, these depictions of these gods and goddesses. And if you look at those aren't 100% accurate of what it was, but they're kind of symbolic of it. What you see is that ancient peoples, the way they understood the gods and goddesses is that the gods and goddesses were very distant. The gods and goddesses were very self-centered. They were very prideful. They were all about power and vengeance, and they didn't really care about people. I mean, they used people for their own means. So gods and gods would use people, because the gods were always at war with each other, trying to get power, trying to get control. And so they would use people to defeat the other gods for their own benefit. And so this is why ancient people, and this is pretty much true of all civilizations, kind of lived in fear of the gods, of what the gods would do. And so much of ancient religion is based around how do I appease these gods or goddesses so they won't strike me dead and maybe they'll do something good for me. So when Israel comes along and Israel claims, no, our God is actually a comforting God. This is like a radical deviation from what everyone else believed about the gods and goddesses. It is a challenge. It is a whole new idea of who or what a God might be like. And more than just being a comforter, Israel's understanding of God as a comforter was rooted in the fact that their God's primary trait and characteristic was love. Their God was a loving God. You see that in places like Exodus 34, verse 6. The Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. This was the foundation of Israel's understanding about God, which again is a radical deviation from everyone else around them. That Israel would proclaim and they would worship and they would say, our God is a God of love. And because of that, our God is a God who actually comforts us, who brings us comfort in the midst of our grief and of our sorrow and of our loss. That idea of God was very much a challenge to the ancient world in which Israel existed. And I actually believe that the idea of God as a comforting God is very much a challenge to culturally what we tend to believe about God, but in a very different way. I've had the privilege of really kind of traveling all over the world and interacting with people of various faith traditions and talking about God. And depending on where you go, people from their faith tradition, some faith traditions have just one God. I've been to places where they'll have like kind of a whole pantheon of gods and goddesses, and just being able to talk to people about, in your faith tradition, how do you understand God? What is God like? But I've also had the privilege of talking to a lot of Christian people around the world from different places and different areas with different stories and different experiences. And one of the things I find interesting is depending upon where someone lives and the history of that place, it shapes how we understand God. Now, Christians all over the world, we worship the same God, but again, the history of the place that we are from does kind of shape and form maybe certain attributes of God and gets us to highlight certain things that people from other areas may not kind of have that same focus. Last spring, I got the privilege of going into like the heart of the Middle East. And we were there was a team that probably about 5 or 6 of us that went, and we got to do all kinds of really incredible things. We visited refugee camps and did some programs in refugee camps. We worked in family centers and did things for kids. We did things for parents. But one of the reasons that I went specifically is I was going to teach a class in a Bible institute on the book of Acts. And the work that was going on in this part of the region in the Middle East, we've been working with them for a long time as a church. We've been partnering with them. And they've just been able to do incredible things. And so the fact that this Bible Institute exists in the heart of the Middle East, it's not like a secret from the government. Like, it's registered with the government knows what's going on, and it's just incredible. But this region in the Middle East has not even an ancient history, but a recent history of just incredible pain and loss. This region of the Middle East was at one time under the control of Saddam Hussein and his regime. And then after Saddam's regime fell, a while later, ISIS came through, and this particular area was never under the control of ISIS, but they were on the front lines with ISIS. And so they have this history of just pain and loss and violence and grief and death, and talking to some of the people who got to meet there and hearing like their firsthand stories of what they went through, what their families went through, the people close to them that they'd lost. There's just a lot of pain and a lot of grief. And so as I was preparing to teach this class on the book of Acts, I was going through, and I like the book of Acts. The book of Acts is the book in the New Testament that tells the story of the early church. And there's a particular story in Acts chapter 5 that every time I've ever talked about it, every time I've had discussions about it, people in a Western context, like in the US, we really struggle with this story. And it's the story of Ananias and Sapphira. And if you're not familiar with this story, I'll give you kind of the condensed version is Ananias and Sapphira lie to the church and they are instantly struck down dead. And so it is this story that really kind of portrays God harshly. And it's like, really? I mean, is that what happens? You make one mistake and you're struck down dead? So every time I've ever talked about this story, there's always been this like, hey, we want to talk about this and we want to wrestle with this. And what does this actually say about God and what's really happening here? So as I'm preparing this class to teach at this institute, when it got to Ananias and Sapphira, I'm like, okay, we'll leave a little bit of time there to kind of wrestle through this and process through and ask and answer questions. So we get to the class, and we get to the section on Ananias and Sapphira, and we read the story, and I asked the class, there's about 17 people in the class, all from different backgrounds. Like some of them were Christian, some of them were actually studying for like ministry certificates because they wanted to be church leaders. Some of them were not Christian at all. They were Islamic and they just were interested in the Bible. All of them came from an Islamic background at one time though, even if they're now Christian. So we read the story of Ananias and Sapphira, and I asked them, I said, all right, what do you think about that? Does that bother you at all? And everyone in the class is like, no, that's exactly what should have happened. They should have been struck down dead instantly. And I was like, okay, I just left like a half hour for us to talk about this, and it doesn't seem to bother any of you at all, and what are we gonna do now? And so again, coming from like my own Western perspective, at first I was kind of taken back, and I'm like, this is interesting, because back home, this is a huge issue, but here it doesn't really seem to be an issue. And what I learned, and I didn't learn it instantly in that moment, but what I went on to understand is it would have been really easy for me to stand there as a Westerner with my own history and my own experiences and to look at these people who have a very different life from me and just to say, well, you have a violent understanding of God, and your God, maybe it's shaped by your Islamic background. You have a view of God that's judgmental or whatever, but that's not what I found. That everyone in that room believed God to be just as loving as I did. And they needed God's love. They needed God's grace. They needed God's forgiveness, and they needed God's mercy. And they believed that was at the heart of who God was. But again, like I said, these are also people that experienced a level of tragedy and pain and grief that I don't even know that I or most of us could imagine. And so for them, if God was good, and if God was just, and if God was making everything right, and this is what kind of the story of the New Testament goes on to tell us, that God, through the person of Jesus, is making all things new, right? He's restoring heaven and earth, bringing everything back together. Then that meant God would have to overcome evil and even evil people. Because in the West, when we think about evil, we think about it more as a concept. There's this thing that is evil. But these people's history, no, evil was people. Evil was flesh and blood. It wasn't a concept that killed my family. It wasn't a concept that forced us to leave home and abandon everything. It was people. And so it wasn't this judgmental, angry view of God. It was this view of God that was rooted in justice. And if God is going to make things right, this is what he has to do. And so everywhere you go, you realize that, hey, the local histories of the places that we live, they impact our view of God. And so if you look at us, those of us who live in the US, we live in what's known as the Western world, but specifically in the US, our culture has very much been shaped by democracy and capitalism. I mean, these are arguably the two strongest forces that have shaped the culture in which we live. And so what that has created is a very consumeristic type faith. I mean, we in our context invented the phrase church shopping. I'm just gonna go find a church that I like and that agrees with me the most, and that's where I'll go. Let me just tell you, that doesn't exist in most places in the world if you've never traveled. In some places, that's not even an option. What happens if you don't like your church? Well, there's only one church. But because again, we kind of have that. So we have this very consumeristic understanding of faith, and sometimes that even translates into how we view and understand God. So a lot of times in a consumeristic faith, we tend to view God as a helper in our own story. And I found this really fascinating. There were studies that were done. A 2023 Pew Research report found that 88% people in this country, in the US, believe in a God or a higher power. So almost 9 in 10 people, we may not know what it is, we may not know how to define it. It's not necessarily, the God of Israel or the God of the church or whatever, but there is some God, there is some higher being. And at the same year, 2023, there was a one poll survey that found that 90% of people in the US believe in karma. So that idea that you get what you give. So if I give something good, I get something good. And so what's interesting about that is if you look at, this culture that's very much shaped by democracy and capitalism, we have these 9 in 10 people pretty much believe there is a God, but also one of the foundational beliefs is this idea of karma. So what we have culturally is this view of God that if I do certain things, God owes me certain things. If I'm a good person, then God is now obligated to bless me, whatever that might mean. And some of us will even have a checklist, if I do these things, I go to church, I'm a nice person, I'm a good neighbor, I volunteer, I give to charity, then God owes me prosperity. And God owes me prosperity in my life, and whether it's my business, my work, my family, whatever. And so what I find is this idea that God is our comforter, that's not really what we want. Here's what we want. We don't want God to be our comforter, we want God to give us comfort. And there's a very big difference between those two things. Because we talked about how being a comforter is about grief, right? Being a comforter begins with, there was a loss that happened. Something happened and there was loss, so now we experience sorrow or loneliness or isolation or despair, whatever it might be, and comforting is about entering into that grief and providing a sense of relief or hope. Comfort is about ease and prosperity. And that's what most of us want from God. God, I want you to make my life comfortable and I want you to make it prosperous. But that's not what Israel claimed. In fact, if you look back, we read that psalm earlier. That's one example in the psalm. There's multiple examples of Israel saying that God was a comforter. But if you look at the whole context, if you read that whole psalm, the reason why God is a comforter is because there's been pain and loss and tragedy. And so God enters into that pain as comforter. But there's nowhere that God says, I will give you comfort. And so what we tend to do culturally, because of our background and our cultural shaped reality, is we take this idea of God as a comforter and we twist it into, we want God to bring us comfort. And actually, probably one of the verses in the Old Testament that we do this the most is Jeremiah 29:11. And if you're familiar with Jeremiah 29:11, it is one of the most famous verses, one of the most quoted verses in the entirety of the Old Testament. And here's how Jeremiah 29:11 goes. It says, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans for welfare and not for evil. Plans to give you future and a hope." A lot of translations will use the word prosper. That God says, here's the plans I have for you, and I have plans to prosper you. This is the kind of verse that I would always say that this is the kind of verse my grandma would crochet on a pillow and have in her house. Right? Or it's the kind of thing that you make a craft out of and you hang it on the wall in your dining room, because it's this reminder, and we like it because it's like, look, here's this verse that God is promising prosperity to us. And God is promising that he's going to give us all these things. But if that's our understanding of Jeremiah 29:11, we completely misunderstand what Jeremiah 29:11 is actually saying, because that's not what God is saying at all. Jeremiah 29, that chapter actually contains a letter that was written by the prophet Jeremiah to a group of exiles who had been kicked out of their home in and around Jerusalem. We said at the beginning that when you look at the first part of the Bible, the Old Testament, it essentially tells you the story of ancient Israel. And ancient Israel's story in the Old Testament is kind of bookended by these two events. One is the Exodus, the other is the exile. Now there's things in the Old Testament before the Exodus, there's things after the exile, but those two things kind of mark the history of Israel. The Exodus is the story of Moses, and God sends Moses into Egypt, and the Hebrew people, that's what they're called at that time, are slaves in Egypt. And through all these miracles and plagues, Moses leads the people out of Egypt. They settle in the land of Canaan. They become the nation of Israel. Exodus is like their foundational story. The other end of that is the exile. And the exile essentially marks the end of the nation of Israel. The people continue, but that's where the nation ends. And the exile officially happens in 586 BCE. Babylon marches into what is left of Israel. They go into Jerusalem, they destroy Jerusalem, they destroy the temple, they leave it nothing but a pile of rubble and ash, and they take all the people who are living in that area and they exile them. They force them to go live somewhere else within the Babylonian Empire. And that really marks the end of the kingdom of Israel. There's a remnant, and the story kind of goes on a little bit, but those two things mark they're the bookends on ancient Israel's story. Jeremiah is the prophet who gets the distinction of living through the experience of the exile. There's other prophets who get to warn that, hey, this is coming. There's prophets that come after the exile that are like, hey, wasn't that awful? But Jeremiah gets the pleasure of, no, I actually get to live through this. And the thing about the exile is the exile actually happens in phases. So 586 is when everything falls apart. But the exile actually begins in 597 BCE. At that point, Babylon marches into Jerusalem, but they don't destroy it. What they do is they kind of take control, they occupy it essentially, and they take all the best and brightest people, the people they think that can be the most beneficial in service to Babylon, and they exile them first, and they send them all over the place. And so it's between 597 and 586 that Jeremiah writes this letter to this first group of exiles. So when Jeremiah writes this letter, the reality of what the exile becomes, the total destruction, it's not there yet. So there's still this hope among, first of all, the exiles living in Babylon, but also the people back home that, hey, we might still get out of this. Maybe we'll still be saved from this. I mean, I know it looks bad, but God could still intervene. God could do something great. There's even people in Babylon, Jewish people who are in Babylon, who that's what they're saying. They're saying, no, this is not the end. God's going to rescue us. He's going to take us back home. We're not going to be here very long. So it's in the middle of that God tells Jeremiah, hey, send this letter to this group of exiles. And so this is how the letter in Jeremiah 29 begins. Verse 4. Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, to all the exiles whom I have sent into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and live in them. Plant gardens and eat their produce. Take wives and have sons and daughters. Take wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage that they may bear sons and daughters. Multiply there, do not decrease. So the first thing that's wild in this is that God takes credit for the exile. God's like, you know why you're in Babylon? Because that's where I want you. And so this thing that they would have looked at as like, this is this horrible thing, this is this terrible thing, God's encouragement to them is he says, no, I need you to understand, I'm up to something. That at no point does God say, hey, this is good or this is perfect, but God says, no, but even in the midst of this, I'm up to something. And actually, if you fast forward, what becomes cool is the exile is what spreads Judaism throughout that part of the world, that region of the world. And wherever Jews go, they'll establish synagogues, like kind of local churches. And then in the New Testament, the Apostle Paul, who's the guy who spreads Christianity all over the Roman world, his strategy begins with these synagogues. And so this is what God is telling the people. He's like, look, I'm up to something here. And so what I need you to do is I need you to put down roots where you are because this is your home. So it's not gonna end quickly, right? This is your home, so live there, engage there. Engage the community in the place in which you live. Build houses, plant gardens, have your kids get married, continue to grow. It goes on in verse 7. But seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare. For thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, do not let your prophets and your diviners who are among you deceive you. And do not listen to the dreams that they dream, for it is a lie that they are prophesying to you in my name. I did not send them, declares the Lord. So God tells him, he says, listen, not only do you have to engage and live in the place where you are, I need you to seek the peace and the prosperity of that place. To seek the peace and prosperity of the home city of our enemies, our oppressors, the people who have conquered us. God, not to mention the people who hate you because they worship the high god of Babylon was a god named Marduk. So God, they don't like you, they don't like us, we don't share the same values, This is the place you want us to seek the peace and prosperity of. And God says, yes, because guess what? It's not just their home, it's your home too. And so your prosperity is tied to their prosperity. And then God tacks on one little thing. He's like, by the way, you know those people that are among you that are like, it's gonna end soon, don't get comfortable. God's like, yeah, those people are idiots, don't listen to them. They don't know what they're talking about. I did not send them. This is your home, live there. Seek the peace and prosperity of that place, of these people who you consider your enemies. And then he goes on in verse 10, he actually gives them kind of a bigger picture of, because here's the plan, just so you know. Verse 10, for thus says the Lord, when 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will visit you, and I will fulfill to you my promise and bring you back to this place. And if you remember, the very next verse, Jeremiah 29:11, is that, for I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and to give you hope in the future. But the plan is 70 years in exile. Which again, if you know anything about the ancient world, average life expectancy is like 35 years. So the plan is, you're gonna die in exile, your kids are gonna die in exile, your grandkids, they'll get home when they're a little bit older, your great-grandkids, they'll be home. But by the way, when you go home, everything's gonna be destroyed. It's gonna be rubble and ash, so you're really not going home to anything. This is the plan. And then comes that verse. But don't worry, because I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and to give you hope and a future. God, that plan is not hope and a future. That is a terrible plan. A literal awful plan. The good plan is, let's go back home now while everything's still constructed, the temple's there, our life is still there. This plan is awful. See, the Israelite exiles would not have heard Jeremiah 29:11 the same way that you and I tend to quote it or read it when it's on my grandma's little pillow. Because what God is offering them is not comfort. It's not ease. It's not prosperity the way that we would define prosperity. God's acknowledging it's gonna be really hard for you. It's going to be really uncomfortable for you. It's not going to be easy. But God also says, but there is hope. Just because it's difficult doesn't mean there's not hope. Just because it's difficult doesn't mean that I'm not up to something. And what you learn about God in this whole experience of the exile is you learn what actually bringing comfort means. Because Israel proclaims, right, our God is a God who brings us comfort. Our God is a God who in the midst of our grief and our loss, he brings us comfort. But the question is, like, how does he do that? In the midst of the exile, how is it? God is not giving them comfort, but he is their comforter. Well, how exactly does God function as our comforter in the midst of our own pain and grief and loss? When I was in college, my home church gave me an internship to work as a part of the staff. And I worked primarily in the youth department. And my boss was a guy by the name of Doug. And he still to this day is one of my mentors. I love Doug. And Doug, before he went into ministry, he was a fireman paramedic. And so he had seen some things, he dealt with some things like dealing with trauma or even people dying. Like he had seen all that, he dealt with all that. Doug is a very loving guy, he's a very caring guy, but he's not an overly emotional guy. He doesn't get over, and part of that is when your background's a fireman paramedic, that's kind of what you have to do. And so working in a church, working in ministry, we'd done some pretty tragic funerals. We'd met with some people in some pretty difficult situations. But again, Doug he was very caring, very loving, but never overly emotional. I was really close with not just Doug, but his whole family, his wife, Georgia, and they had 2 young little boys. And I guess it was a couple years or so after they had come to our church, they got this little dog. It was the first dog they ever had, and they were so excited about this dog, and I got to meet this dog, and it was a cool little dog. And about a week after they had the dog, Doug came into work, and he was like, yeah, the dog died. It had gotten parvo, and it died. And Doug said it in a very Doug-like way of saying things. Like you could tell he was sad, but not really overly emotional. And I told him, I said, Doug, I'm really sorry to hear that, and I'm sorry for your wife, sorry for your boys. And we kind of ran on the rest of the day, and I really didn't think much of it. And that later on that kind of afternoon, I was talking to my family, my mom and dad and my sister, and they were pretty close with their family too. And my sister, who's got a way better heart than I do, she's like, we should take them ice cream. I was like, why should we take them ice cream? And she goes, it'll just be a nice thing to do. And I'll just so you know, like I'm a dog person. We have 2 dogs. We had a dog before, and man, when a dog or a pet dies, it is like devastating. Murphy, who was my little dog before, when he died, I was like messed up for like a week. And so I knew how sad it was, but in my mind, I'm like, yeah, but it's Doug. I mean, he's been through stuff like this. And my sister's like, no, it would just be really good. Let's take them ice cream. So I said, okay. So my sister and I went to the store, got a couple gallons of ice cream, and we went over to their house. And I went up and I knocked on the door, and I was standing right up next to the door, and my sister was behind me. And Doug opened the door, and he was bawling. Only time I've ever seen him, he was just bawling. And I looked behind him, and there was his wife and the 2 boys on the couch, and they were bawling. And he did something he's never done before. He reached out, and he pulled me in, and he just started hugging me and squeezing me. And I, as you can tell, I'm not a tall person. And so his tears were literally like falling on my head. And he just held me like really, really tight. Then after a while, he kind of let go, and we stepped back, and they invited us in, and we scooped ice cream. And we sat down together, and we were there for maybe an hour. We didn't say a whole lot. I mean, we did talk, but we were just there. And we were eating ice cream. And when it came time for us to leave, we told him we loved him, we prayed with him, we hugged him, and we left. But I learned something that day. I learned something really, really important. I learned that being a comforter is about physical presence. It's about being there in the midst of pain and grief. See, a lot of times when we go through pain or grief, our first questions are, we want an explanation. We want to know why. Why did this happen? Why this? And here's what I've learned though. Even if I could stand up here and give you a completely rational explanation for your loss or your grief, and I don't have an answer for what it's worth, but let's assume that I do. And I could rationally explain it to you. Your response would not be, oh, that's great, Scott, thank you very much. I totally understand it, I'm okay with it, I hope it happens again really soon. No, you'd still be devastated. Because grief and loss isn't about a rational explanation, it's about love. It's about like this person or this thing that was so important to us being gone. It's about pain. And so resolving grief, bringing comfort, isn't about being a rational explanation. It's about being present in the midst of that pain and that loss. And see, this was also central to Israel, and what Israel claimed about their God is the reason their God was a comforting God is because their God was a present God. Their God was a God who was with them. Again, you look at all these other ancient civilizations, the gods are always somewhere else. Apparently, or occasionally they'll show up to earth, but only really when they want something. And then usually when they come to earth, they cause a mess and then they leave. But Israel's God is a God who was present, always present. The prophet Isaiah says in the Old Testament, the whole earth is filled with God's glory. And if you look through the stories in Israel's past, Israel's story kind of begins with, really the story of everything, Adam and Eve in the garden, and everything falls apart. But God doesn't abandon them. He sews them clothes, makes them clothes, stays with them, even in the midst of their pain and their shame and their grief. When God introduces himself to Moses, right? Moses is gonna go lead the Exodus, and Moses says, hey, what do I tell the people when they ask who sent me? God introduces his name, and the name is I am, which is the present tense of the verb to be. So God says, who am I? I am always present. I am always here. I am always now. I am always with you. The God who, when Elijah, the prophet Elijah, is running for his life because the king and the queen are trying to kill him, God feeds Elijah and lets him rest. See, Israel, the reason why Israel's God is a comforting God is because Israel's God is a present God. A God who is with his people. The pinnacle of Israel's story, the climax of Israel's story, actually doesn't happen in the Old Testament. The climax of Israel's story happens in the New Testament. Out of the remnant of Israel is born Israel's Messiah, their Savior, Jesus. And in Jesus, what happens is Israel's present and comforting God literally comes to earth physically in the person of Jesus. And God now is among and he's with his people in like actual flesh and blood. That's why Jesus says, hey, if you've seen God, you've seen me. That in Jesus is this ultimate sign that God is always present and among his people. And God ultimately shares in the suffering and the pain of his people through the death, the burial, then ultimately the resurrection of Jesus. And Jesus is this ultimate sign that God is with and among his people. The word we use at Christmas is Emmanuel, right? God with us. And Jesus, after his resurrection, he's getting ready to ascend into heaven. He's overcome death. He's conquered death. He's now Lord and King over everything. But in the Gospel of Matthew, the last thing Jesus tells his followers before he ascends into heaven is this. Matthew 28:20, and behold, I am with you always to the end of the age. In a few moments, we're gonna move into a time of communion. And so if you're gonna help serve communion, if you go ahead and make your way to the back for that. But these are Jesus' final words. I will be with you always. And even though he physically leaves, what he does is he sends his spirit, which literally, the word spirit means presence. He sends his presence to live among his people. And see, today we still speak of God as our comforter because he's present among us as his people, as his church, through his spirit. Now, it's one thing to just say that, to be like, oh, God is present through his spirit and he comforts us. But it's another thing to actually experience that. A lot of us want to believe that. We want to believe that God is our comforter, but we don't necessarily experience it. And I think one of the big reasons for that is because a lot of us don't cultivate our lives in such a way as to be aware of the presence of God. There's a great story in the Old Testament about the prophet Elijah, and Elijah is going to meet God, and there's like a raging fire, and there's like a powerful wind, and there's a violent earthquake, but God's not in any of those things. And then there's a whisper. Literally, some translations say the sound of silence, and that's where God is. That being aware of God's presence is about cultivating a life that allows it. It's about slowing down. It's about engaging in certain practices that make us aware of the presence of God. And throughout the New Testament, the number one practice for cultivating a life that's aware of the presence of God is prayer. This is ultimately what prayer is about. It's about living our lives with such a posture that we become aware that God is with us and among us. And I know for some of us, prayer is a really simple thing. There's a lady at our church that literally can pray for like 8 hours a day. Sometimes she'll just say, we have this little chapel, and she'll be like, can I just come in the chapel and pray for 8 hours? And I'm like, that is impressive. Because because I can go for about 8 seconds and then I start getting sidetracked. And so if you're a person who prayer is easy for you, man, go for it. You do you. But for some of us, like, man, it's a difficult thing. Like, how do we do it? I just want to give you something that's been really helpful for me. In the Protestant tradition within Christianity, we tend to like be distrusting of written out prayers, right? We think prayer should be totally spontaneous. But I've actually found that written prayers can be very, very helpful. And so one of the things I do is I'll use the Psalms, we talked about Psalms earlier, to kind of guide my prayers. And so sometimes I'll just open to a random Psalm, but sometimes, like literally, if you're going through something, like you're going through uncertainty or doubt or grief, just go to Google and type like Psalm of Grief. And it'll give you like Psalm such and such is a Psalm of Grief, and turn to that one. And I'll read through the Psalm and I will let that Psalm guide my prayer. So if the Psalm opens up with something like, Lord, help me love my enemies, then I'll stop and I'll think, who are my enemies? Who are the people that I need to love? And if the next verse is like, God, forgive me of my sins, like, what is it that I need to be forgiven of? And I'll let the words of that Psalm guide my thoughts and my heart. And that's become a really powerful way in my life for me to engage in prayer in a way that opens me up to the presence and then ultimately the comfort of God. As Jesus said, Matthew 5:4, blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. See, when we can cultivate an awareness, when we can engage in practices like prayer and cultivate an awareness of the presence of God in our life, then we experience him as comforter, even in the midst of our grief.